Welcome to Atlas Live, Atlas Public Policy's live video podcast that brings together industry and policy leaders for lively discussions on the future of clean technology, transportation, the built environment, manufacturing, climate change, and more.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. Really excited to get started today. I'm your host, Rachael Nealer, here at Atlas Public Policy, and I am joined by my colleagues Josh Rodriguez from the American Association of State Highway Transportation Officials, and my real colleague, actually sitting very close to me in the office, Tina Hodges from Atlas Public Policy. Welcome, both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rachael.
Really excited to get this started. We're going to talk about state DOTs and the future of EV charging, near and dear to my heart. But first, we're going to start with a little bit of table setting, kind of where are we with the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program? And we have been making a lot of progress over the last couple years. At this point in time, we have 42 states that have approved plans all the way through the 5-year program. We have 45 states that have offered solicitations, and what that means is that they have started the process of selecting stations and putting them in the ground. We have 40 states that have awarded funds to contractors to install EV charging stations. We have 20 states that actually have operational charging stations. And then if you want to get really wonky with me, we have 11 states that are fully built out. And we won't go into all the details about fully built out, but it does allow flexibility of EV charging funding. That is very exciting to me. And I think we'll talk a little bit about the future of EV charging and some of the flexibility going forward. So that's kind of the level setting of where we are with the NEVI program. But we're also debuting a new report that was funded by AASHTO and written by Tina and team here at Atlas Public Policy. So I'm going to hand it over to Tina. Tina, will you tell us about the new Atlas report and really what you found most interesting?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So for this project, our colleagues at the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials, AASHTO, asked us to develop a comprehensive state of the practice report on how transportation agencies, especially at the state level, are deploying electric vehicle charging infrastructure. They also asked us for recommendations for their members. So our team here at Atlas analyzed a whole ton of data sources, especially those on our platform, Atlas EV Hub. We reviewed the literature, we co-hosted a workshop with state DOTs and partners, and conducted interviews to gather information. Some of our key findings were that state DOTs climbed a really steep learning curve. So for the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, NEVI, that Rachael was just speaking about, she gave some of those progress statistics, which are really impressive, especially considering that most state DOTs had not had experience planning or deploying electric vehicle charging infrastructure in the past. We, through this process, identified a set of best practices that state departments of transportation are using now that we've had these experience with the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, and also drawing from experiences that state energy offices had previously with rebate programs and other incentives for EV charging. So speaking of program design, one of the best practices that we learned is when setting up a new EV incentive program, rebates are really good for rapid deployment of EV charging stations, while grants are better for having more control, evaluating on various factors. Another best practice that we identified is working closely with utilities. For instance, working with the electric utility and ensuring that they can provide hosting capacity maps is really helpful, because that identifies areas where there's existing capacity on the grid to install electric vehicle charging, rather than having to make an expensive and timely investment in upgrading grid infrastructure. Another best practice regarding requests for proposals and contracts is having careful scoring rubrics that are very clear to the companies that are applying to be the contractor to build the EV charging station so that they know what the state is looking for, what their goals are and requirements are. And speaking of requirements, we also heard that having site host commitments in place is really important. Some of the states learned early on the hard way where site hosts were not aware of all of the requirements and they had to withdraw after they had already been selected. So states are learning from that and having success accordingly. We also heard that using standardized contracts is really helpful for streamlining. On the permitting side, we've heard that working with local officials on streamlining permitting is really important. For long-term planning, we've heard that integrating EV charging into long-range transportation plans is very helpful, and that considering strategies like bundling low and high utilization sites can really help in terms of making it more feasible for the private sector to step in as a contractor for low utilization sites.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for that summary, Tina. And a lot to cover there. And I will say that it is a comprehensive report. It is 70 pages. But I'd love to hear Josh's reactions. You've read the report. We've held a workshop on the report now as well. What stands out to you about what the states have been doing? And have you heard from the states about what really has resonated with them in this report?
Super. Thank you, Rachel. And thank you, Tina, for the recap there of the report. So I've been doing environmental work my entire career. But when I started doing EV charging infrastructure with DOTs, I felt like I was getting into this business at the same time they were, which I found hugely helpful because if I didn't understand it, the state DOTs didn't understand it. So they have learned I've learned alongside them, and we've learned a lot, from the initial stages of NEVI. And I always actually argue that EV charging and EV charging infrastructure deployment, it's not a study in the environmental space or environmental engineering. It's a study of economics, really. And that's really what I think most of these states have learned from the get-go, is that this is, not just transportation planning. It's not just something that they've been doing day to day in their state DOT operations or, their day jobs. This is a whole new world for state DOTs. And it really helped that we were able to learn from the state energy offices from their early deployments. As it relates to, what states have learned so far and what they've taken from this report, there are a lot of good takeaways that Tina mentioned. But the global takeaway, I think, is the partnerships that they built and created. And I don't think we could have done this without the energy offices, without the community-based organizations and utilities, and those that we really met with on a regular basis and convened meetings and webinars and workshops to teach and provide those resources to the states to help them deploy NEVI. And I think that's reflected in the report. And I think that's the biggest takeaway from states. But I think that there's more in this report that people can learn from down the road. And I know we'll talk a little bit more about that going forward here. But that's really what we wanted to see from the report, is using NEVI as an example and showing the lessons learned by states for the next phases. What's the next steps here? And I think that this report does a good job of showing that.
Yeah, thanks so much, Josh. I totally agree. And that's, it was really evident, I think, too, in the workshop that we held just a couple of weeks ago. So we got together a handful of stakeholders from states. AASHTO was there hosting, along with Fourth Mobility and Atlas Public Policy, and really just had kind of an in-person workshop around this report that was really great to see, frankly. Josh and I were there in person, and it was really great. Had a couple other colleagues from Atlas Public Policy join, but we heard from Nevada, Oregon, Georgia, Colorado, all about their programs, what progress they've seen. And I can't agree with you more, Josh. I think that every step of the way, the state DOTs have really risen to the occasion for NEVI. It was a difficult program to implement. I was there from the beginning at the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation as well. And they just blow me away every single time. And seeing these presentations from those states, focused on really thorny issues like rural charging. What are the additional barriers and challenges with rural charging? But overall, my takeaway from that workshop was collaboration is key. And we need to keep collaborating, and that's across utilities, which we heard from the presenters, the site hosts reaching out, state DOTs reaching out early and often to site hosts to explain exactly what Tina was talking about. All the requirements for some of these programs. But then what was highlighted was also regional collaborations, like the Western Rev states that have gotten together. The Western Regional Electric Vehicle states have gotten together. And we got a presentation from my colleague, Ben Sharp, who really talked about the progress relatively early on of the Clean Corridors Project, which is also multiple states, Delaware, New Jersey, Maryland, and Connecticut, working to electrify I-95 for medium and heavy duty. So really great opportunity. Thanks to AASHTO for making it possible. Josh, any additional takeaways from the workshop that you had or that you're hearing from states?
Personal takeaways, I love working with community organizations like Forth and with Atlas Public Policy here. It really gives states and organizations like AASHTO an opportunity to dive deeper into the nuance of the act local, think global kind of like concept there. And state DOTs are great in these larger infrastructure and transportation projects. But when it comes down, especially to EV charging, it's those level 2 opportunities. It's the community and workplace charging opportunities. How can we support multifamily housing? And without organizations like Forth and other community-based organizations, the state DOTs really don't have as much of an opportunity as people kind of think. They clearly, coordinate and organize with MPOs and other localities on large transportation projects. But when they need to get into neighborhoods and they need to get into communities, it's a little bit more difficult. And so we're happy to help convene workshops like this. I think that we've got a better track record than ever with state DOTs connecting with communities, and whether it's through public involvement or public outreach, they're doing a great job right now in identifying those benefits for communities that are questioning you, like, why are we building an EV charger here? We need more sustainable sidewalks and pedestrian areas. But states are getting better at explaining and helping communities through those those processes and that outreach. And so I think this workshop just continues that that effort that we've put forward, and we can't wait to keep having them. I mean, the more states we get into these community-based workshops where we can directly engage with other stakeholders is great. And it gives a good opportunity too for our states to share their successes.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of continued collaboration opportunities that we all look forward to. I started this episode with kind of some of the high-level statistics about the NEVI program, where we are now. There's been a lot of disruption over the last year and a half, but we're still making progress. But how do we continue to measure progress? Tina, do you have any thoughts on that?
Sure. Well, one metric is the number of electric vehicle charging stations and charging ports that are out there. And we have graphs in our report showing this steep rise in the number of EV charging ports that are available. And that is really a good demonstrator of success. Also, anecdotally, I speak to people all the time who tell me, I've had an EV since 2000 or something, and at first it was hard to find charging stations, but there's just been so many more put out into the world since then that now people can really get where they need to go in most places. So that's another measure of success. And then finally, an important measure of success are the economic benefits. So at Atlas, we have a clean economy tracker. So if you check that out online, you can see it tracks investments in clean manufacturing, including things like manufacturing of electric vehicles, EV batteries, EV chargers, and the number of jobs that are created from those facilities and investments.
Awesome. Awesome. How do you think, Josh, how are we measuring progress these days and moving forward?
So there's a stewardship requirement for NEVI, and 5 years is the general, time frame that I think states are focused on because that's what's in the rule. I think we should start looking at measuring success in uptime, reliability of these federal chargers. We heard very early on in many cases, or not many cases, but several cases where some of the Volkswagen settlement money had gone to chargers that quickly were either out of date or broke down too soon, or were just not reliable. EV drivers, which admittedly I am not one, but I have charged and driven an EV. EV drivers don't care who paid for that charger. They just want to make sure that it works. And if it doesn't work, where's the next one that works? Or how can they get this one fixed because it's in their community? And so when we start talking about success, I think the long-term function, operation, and just general uptime of these chargers is going to start to be the focus, because the value of the NEVI program is only going to be as good as how long these chargers are in the ground for and how well they're working. And I know that states have done an incredible job holding their contractors, holding those service providers accountable to that uptime requirement, and ensuring that their commitments they made in those contracts and the commitments they made, under the NEVI rule are upheld. And I think that's very important, because when other federal investments start to come or state investments start to get put out, we want to know that there's a long-term value to that. We don't just want to say the charger's in the ground. That's awesome. I love groundbreakings. They bring a crowd, and the chargers are very flashy. But we would like to see that charger be just as flashy and just as high use on the groundbreaking day as it is 5 years from now. And then future proofing, that's a whole nother conversation, because it might need an upgrade. It might need new software. So, and I'm sure maybe that's something we'll talk about a little bit later, but I think that's something too that we can start looking at successes, like, where did we get that future proofing right?
Yeah, absolutely. And what you're saying is music to my ears, because I remember in early days at electrification conferences, we were still talking about the chicken and the egg problem, right? So the fact that we're talking about 97% uptime and the quality of these stations, not just the presence of these stations, that to me is overall a really successful progress. Just a few other places where we are tracking progress, especially here at Atlas. So those stats that I gave you up at the top, those come from evstates.org, which do track NEVI investments in particular. But just a couple things that are forthcoming from Atlas soon. We've been working on the impacts of the congressional rescission of some of the NEVI dollars, the repurposing of some of the NEVI dollars. So we'll have a fact sheet soon that shows kind of the charger impact there. And then we also have the zero emission freight strategy that was published a couple of years ago from the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation. And that lays out a whole strategy, and how are we actually assessing our progress towards that strategy as well. So Atlas has a forthcoming fact sheet on that as well. And sneak peek is that we are looking at about 13% of the electrified miles of the total system. We've made progress in the last couple of years since that freight strategy was laid out. So 13% isn't there, and NEVI isn't fully implemented either, but we are making progress. We are making a lot of progress over time, and we're learning a lot of lessons. So maybe back to the report a little bit. What really strikes me about this report, Tina, is that there is kind of a scenario analysis for different states' kind of political realities. Can you share a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So each state faces a different circumstance politically, geographically, et cetera. And so we looked at three basic scenarios and thought about, okay, if a state DOT finds themselves in this particular scenario category, what might they want to do? So the first scenario was for a state where electric vehicle charging is maybe not the top priority. So in those circumstances, what they can do is they can focus on investing their remaining NEVI funding, because those funds are available until expended. And the states typically want to invest the federal funds that they receive to achieve really good benefits for their citizens. So, they can focus on strategically deploying those funds and also on deploying signage for electric vehicle charging stations. So, making sure that there are signs along the highway, just like there are signs that indicate where there's a gas station or a hotel or a restaurant. The official manual for those signs allows for and encourages signage for electric vehicle charging stations as well. So, but it's states who go out and implement that. So state departments of transportation can really focus on deploying that signage, and that's a low budget, relatively low budget activity, and can make a big difference when EV drivers and those who are possibly considering having an EV know that there are chargers out there. So the second scenario was that EV charging is something that the state is, fairly interested in, but the state energy office or some other state entity is the lead, and the State Department of Transportation is more in a supporting role. So in that type of scenario, we're suggesting that the Department of Transportation focus a lot on interagency coordination, making sure that their efforts are supporting the state energy office and other state agencies. They can also work on community charging, which is not just charging along particular highway corridors, but bringing charging to where individuals and drivers go to find convenient charging, such as at shopping centers and libraries and things like that. And then the third scenario is the circumstance where the state considers EV charging a major priority, and the Department of Transportation has a large role. In those circumstances, the DOT can do all of the previous things that I mentioned in the other two scenarios, plus they can focus on really making sure to fill gaps along corridors and in communities. The private sector is going to deploy charging stations. They can make them profitable at this point, but there are some places where it's hard for the private sector to do that. For instance, in areas serving people who don't have access to home charging. So areas where there's a lot of apartments or less affluent communities, the states can target those areas to make sure that charging is available to everyone. Another thing that state DOTs can focus on is charging for medium and heavy duty electric vehicles. So charging for freight trucks. That's particularly important because the larger trucks require a lot more electricity. And those also are fairly expensive. So especially in the early years, public subsidy is often needed to make those viable. And then a third thing that DOTs can focus on is workforce development. So in order to install EV charging stations, service them, you need a strong workforce. So there's a lot of opportunities for electricians or service technicians. For instance, I have a young nephew who's 21 years old and was considering, an electrician training program. And I was talking about EV charging, and there are some good programs now at community colleges for training people to be EV charging technicians, so we can make sure those stations have good uptime, so drivers aren't frustrated, so they can have a good experience and make sure that they're able to charge when they need to. So those are some, the scenarios that we considered and the suggestions that we had for areas to focus on, and so we hope that state DOTs find that helpful.
Yeah, and I think, it's really a launching pad, right? It's a lot of the lessons learned, but this program is still evolving. We're still learning a lot. What I heard from the workshop was that, people are still making a lot of progress, but and have really figured out, frankly, corridor charging really well across states. But we're expanding into other applications as well. Community charging. You heard Tina talk about medium and heavy duty charging. There's a lot of flexibility now in building out not just the backbone of the NEVI program, but also, filling in some of the other needs. And based on a National Lab of the Rockies report, th- we need 1.2 million charging ports in the US. And so NEVI is an element of that, but there's an opportunity to also use other private funding, other public funding like utilities or state funding, um, but also, what happens in the future as well, what happens beyond NEVI. So I'd love to, have that as kind of our last question. What happens beyond NEVI? NEVI is just kind of the beginning, I would say, of building out this EV charging network. We have millions of EVs on the road today. We're going to have to continue to build this infrastructure for those drivers and make it convenient and reliable. But what do you guys see as what's next for NEVI or EV charging in general? Josh?
Oh, so much. I think that with the federal formula program like NEVI, states will get almost tunnel vision into getting that one thing that's eligible under the program out the door or in the ground, related to EV charging. But with beyond that, and with new federal funding opportunities, that are expanding, are available to EV charging infrastructure, or just auxiliary infrastructure, for existing EV charging, there's just so much that state DOTs and other transportation agencies and communities can do to support all this. And Tina touched on a little bit of that in the report, and that's permitting reform and innovative strategies around siting and other infrastructure placement. But I think that there's even more beyond that. When you start to get into like automated and connected vehicle corridors, we're looking at potential innovative use of the right of ways. These are all directly related to EV infrastructure. But just in general, it's new and emerging technologies and new and emerging programs like this that we can take the lessons learned from NEVI and apply them to that. NEVI was a great opportunity for state DOTs, but as mentioned, it was pretty challenging because it was so new. Automation, connected vehicles, the innovative right of way, these are all still very new to state DOTs too. And I think from that lens, we really see that there's a lot more beyond just light duty electrification, which was NEVI. And the next step obviously is medium and heavy duty, and then beyond that, looking into connected and automated. But beyond that, I mean, it's just more and more like when the next program comes in, because the next new technology, whether it's like robo taxis or air mobility and all that fun stuff, I think that this is just kind of that stepping stone to all these new and exciting transportation opportunities and programs that are going to continue to come up, and we can learn a lot from the NEVI program and take a lot with us.
Yeah. I mean, kids listening, if you hear that, it sounds like state DOTs are going to be transportation innovation hubs for a long time to come. So check out your state DOTs for job postings.
That's a good workforce plug.
Yeah. Tina, what do you think?
Yeah, sure. So, what comes after NEVI? There are so many opportunities. State DOTs climbed that steep learning curve and can really do a lot now to deploy EV charging. And a lot of states, they're still spending their NEVI funds. Those are available even past, the 2026 timeframe. It's unclear, what'll happen with federal programs in terms of transportation reauthorization. Generally, there are these, the biggest programs are these large formula programs. So states generally have a lot of flexibility to fund, highways, bridges, EV charging, public transportation, active transportation. They have a lot of options to meet the needs of their particular state. There's also more opportunities to work with the private sector and make sure that they understand what the private sector needs and where it makes most sense for the private sector to take the lead versus the public sector to fill in gaps where it doesn't make sense for the private sector to go. So those are just some post-NEVI opportunities to think about.
Yeah. I mean, I think electrification is here to stay, and we'll see it continue to evolve and evolve into other technologies as well, integrating with the future technologies. So I just want to say thank you so much for your time. Thank you, Josh, for joining us here at our Atlas offices, and thank you, Tina and team, John and Jacqueline, for writing this wonderful report that is going to serve, I think it's not often that we have the opportunity to spend so much time reflecting, but this is a really important program to reflect on. Exactly to Josh's point, it's going to serve as the framework for lots of additional innovation. So thank you for taking the time to chat with me today, and hope everyone has a nice day.
Thank you, Rachel.